This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. We will begin the Building, Zoning, and Development Committee this evening at 7:15 p.m. Present are committee members Williamson, Limpert, and Schuman, council members Broussard, Glassburn, Heeman, and Kelly, our council president, the mayor, our law director, our human resources director, our planning director, our building commissioner, and guests. On the agenda this evening is ordinance number 2020-145, an ordinance providing for the amendment of chapter 1135, 1 and 2 family residence districts of the codified ordinances of the city of North Olmsted. This meeting tonight is a continuation of our committee meeting on this topic from January, where a number of amendments had been requested. And at this time, I believe everyone has in their possession the new amended version. So I'm going to turn over the floor to Director Lieber for any additional comments, and then I will open up the floor to committee members and then council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the last meeting, there was a lot of general discussion, but some more specific areas and recommendations for amendments from council. So the law director and I did the best we could to take that input and turn it into the amendments that are before you. So in the version forwarded to council in early February, the red edits are those that are original, and the blue edits are those that are the changes since that last committee meeting. The first area we looked at was recreational vehicles. There had been some concern about the change in the language, that using a more qualitative standard could make it difficult for enforcement or create confusion of when recreational vehicles could be permitted to be parked in driveways. And so we changed the standard to, and we're proposing to use a standard that driveways may be used for recreational vehicle parking not more than 7 consecutive days, and not more than 28 days total in a calendar year. And then we have some language about how that would be calculated. We felt that that would be a bit easier than the current standard, which deals with 72 hours within a consecutive 21-day period, because it doesn't place any limits on how many consecutive 21-day periods in a calendar year there could be. So that was the first change in the RV section. And then there was some concern about the language in item 2 in that section, that it seemed backwards, that the language seemed to put the exception before the rule, or the rule before the exception. So we flipped it around, changed some language to try and make it more clear for those reading it as to what would be permitted and what is not permitted in terms of storing recreational vehicles outside. So that was the first area of change. We also, in the temporary ramp section, increased the time for removal of a ramp from 30 to 90 days, keeping in mind that to some extent this is also self-identified by the property owner. The property owner will determine when and let the city know when the ramp is no longer necessary. So from the point that they alert us that it's no longer necessary, that would provide 3 months. And then lastly, I believe, Madam Chair, it was your request that we be more specific on the types of screening required around HVAC units, that condensers that are in a required yard. And so we improved that language to be more specific about screening. And again, screening only required when in a required yard, not just placed on the side of a house, but if it's encroaching into a required yard. So those were the 3 areas. We felt we had some specific direction from council to make amendments. If you have any questions or want to discuss these or any other areas, we're happy to entertain your dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. And thank you for getting these amendments done in these sections. I'm satisfied with the way they read right now. So I'm going to open it up to committee members for any comments or suggestions. Mr. Limbert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my only question is this, the fencing or vegetation around the air conditioner in the side yard. If it's off the lot line by the required amount that most structures, other structures are required from the lot line, I don't understand why we need to have vegetation around it, because if anything, that would probably protrude further closer to the neighboring yard.
Madam Chair, in response, so there's a difference between a unit that is installed in a side yard versus a required side yard. So the word required means that setback in which nothing can be built. So no dwelling or attachment to the dwelling. So there is no screening requirement. Let's say our setback requirement is 10 feet. If the unit is set back at least 10 feet, there's no screening requirement. What this provides for is that a condenser unit can project into a required yard, and it says, provided such projection extends no more than 4 feet from the building line, so from the face of the dwelling, and that it's not less than 5 total feet from the side lot line. So that's saying where it's in the required yard, then screening is required. So where it's likely to have a greater impact on the neighboring property. So that would be the instance where screening would be required in this case. If council doesn't want to require screening, if units are in the required side yard, that's your policy decision. This was an attempt to allow more flexibility for the property owner installing the unit, but while protecting the neighbor that would be most impacted by its location.
Yeah, thank you, Director. I guess I'm just, with the vegetation, that's going to end up even pushing further to the lot line to cover the protrusion. I think the fencing is acceptable, but if you're talking evergreen vegetation, then that's going to extend even closer to the lot line, if I'm reading that correctly.
Madam Chair, certainly plant materials could be closer to the lot line, but we have no restriction on the placement of plant materials in our zoning code. So I suppose a property owner could have a hedge or bushes anywhere on their own property regardless.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Any questions from council? Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I recognize I'm in the minority on most of these issues in terms of I would prefer us to not regulate ramps or recreational vehicles, but I'm glad that we made some changes, and if that's the will of the majority, I will happily keep my mouth shut on those. I still don't, though, understand why we are now creating a 50 square foot limitation on projections for 113507A. We didn't have a square footage restriction before. I just don't know why we're getting into that business now.
Madam Chair, and I might have to call upon our building official to help explain. And normally, if we were in a meeting space together, he would probably get out his marker and his paper, which often is a helpful exhibit to explain some of these things. The reason that we believe we should put the 50 square foot limitation is because without providing a limitation, it would effectively allow any dwelling to basically encroach into the front setback by 8 feet all across the front of the property. So, you know, the section 113506 immediately preceding talks about the general setbacks of the dwelling. And then the next section talks about projection. So places where that dwelling or elements of that dwelling can then encroach into required yards. So we're saying that we acknowledge and accept that platforms, steps, and stoops on the front of a dwelling can project into that 50-foot required front setback, so long that it's not more than 8 feet into that front yard. So it's no closer than 42 feet from the front lot line. But what we don't want to do is create a carte blanche where every single housing unit can be every aspect of it can be 42 feet from the front lot line. That would effectively change our required front setback of the dwelling in its entirety. So it's a loophole that we felt we should close. And this is how we propose to do it, to allow for a limited area of that front projection, but not just to allow the entire front of the building to become a projection, which could just be a house addition. So that was our logic and this restriction of the code. And Mr. Grusenmeyer, if you can add to that, or I know this was your recommendation, please feel free to chime in.
Certainly, thank you. I think the intent all along in our zoning ordinance, these are actually, what this refers to isn't your porch or anything like that. It refers to those steps that lead up to your porch or lead up to your front door. So the intention always, I believe, in the zoning ordinance is that there be some allowance if your house is built right up to the setback, or your porch is right up to the setback, that you could have steps up to it that go into your front yard. The way it is written now, if there's no limitation, you can actually have an 8-foot, you could actually build another entirely large porch, 8 feet out and entirely the width of the house. I think it's probably beyond the original intention to have something that large in front of it. I think the original intention was always to allow someone to have steps to enter the porch or to enter the house at the front door. And I think we've had a couple that have come along and have really been quite large. I don't know if it's with the intent of the zoning ordinance to have something that's, 8 feet out into the yard, the entire width of the house. Once again, it's really just this. This applies only to those steps that enter, at the front door, if the front wall of the house is there, or if you have a front porch, to give you some access to allow your steps to project into, but not have something so large that you're constructing an entirely, basically an entirely another porch out into the front yard. And I think it's keeping with the original intent all along of what the zoning ordinance has been traditionally. Thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank you,
Mr. Gross.
Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, unless I'm unaware of a problem that has emerged with overly large steps or overly large porches, I don't see a value in regulating something that might end up tripping up somebody if there isn't a problem, and there's certainly not a safety issue. So the other thing I would, again, I think I come at it from a different reason than Councilman Limpert, but almost all the houses in my area that have the side air conditioners are not, they're closer than they're in the zone that is too close. So I understand they're grandfathered in, but I don't see a value in, again, in effect, creating an entire section of the city that is out of compliance with code on that. Last that I would like to just mention is, for similar reasons, generators in this area, again, are problematic. There's not somewhere you could put it in your yard or in your side yard that isn't going to be within one of these zones. So I don't know, Councilwoman Heeman might have some similar experience in her ward on these.
Go ahead, Councilman Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I completely agree that they should not be regulated the way that they are, generators nor air conditioners. Very often the placement of your generator is going to be based on where the guy coming to put it in thinks it could go because of gas lines, et cetera, and or your air conditioning unit is already in that same placement. Very often folks have already, designed and completed their backyard, and the generator is not like an air conditioner that they would have thought about that they wanted 20 years ago. They're sort of a newer item. And I think that we did regulation that, was apparently at the time sufficient with regard to the noise level of generators. So I don't know why now we're going to double regulate something. And I believe that residents should have the choice of where they would want something like that to go. If there's already something on the side of their house, their neighbor's not already objecting. So I just don't see the value of any of that language in 113507C. So I'm not in favor of that. Thank you.
Director.
The new language in 113507 makes it more permissive for residents to install air conditioning units than the current condition. So by doing away with this section, you would be making more of your dwellings non-conforming. This amendment will help residents who want to install air conditioning units in the side yard, not hurt. In terms of the generators, I know we had previously discussed the noise ordinance, and it is our belief that generators placed in the side yard cannot meet our city's noise ordinance. So allowing for them in the side yard will create an unachievable standard in our noise ordinance, and we feel it's best not to send those mixed messages to residents that yes, you can have it in your side yard, but no, it will not meet our noise requirements, therefore you cannot have it located there. That creates an inherent conflict that we think will be more confusing and problematic for those residents wishing to install generators. Thank you.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think then we need to revisit the noise ordinance because clearly, it was such a great thing at the time and going to serve us well, and it doesn't seem to be effective at that. I really can tell you that I have at least 3 developments in Ward 4 that this air conditioning and generator language is not suited for any of those developments. And I really don't think that you should try to impose on people that they have to dig gas lines all the way around their house and or rip up other amenities in the back of their yard to try to place an air conditioner that was on the side before and or a new generator that they might want. So I don't know how my residents would manage that. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Mr. Limpert?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director, I think reading the blue changes here, I would ask that we get rid of evergreen in the definition of vegetation to open it up to whatever type of vegetation would meet covering, whether it be like tall grasses or flowers or whatever it may be. I think evergreen's overly prescriptive for how they would need to shield that. Did you hear me or was I on mute?
We heard you.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. Director, how do we fix the air conditioner and generator issue that was brought up by council members Glassburn and Heeman? If there's issues with the lot sizes within their respective wards, I'd like to see that we do some accommodation to the homes with the smaller lot sizes. So is there any way to differentiate or make it permissible to move the placement of these items in other areas? Or how can we make this work?
Madam Chair, I do believe that this section, as I've said, is helping residents. It is creating a more liberal construction of what our code currently is. I do have concerns about creating conflicts with our noise ordinance. If this whole section is a concern to council, if you would want to strike the section from the amendment entirely, that's fine with me. We're trying to make it more permissive for residents to be able to have AC units in the side yard. You know, I have some serious concerns about the noise compatibility, but I also have concerns about some of the other sections that we know we definitely want to implement. Maybe we can tackle the generator and AC issue with another piece of legislation so that those residents who are waiting with their, you know, deck and patio and porch permits can be on their way, since it seems like there might be some more disagreement and discussion of how to handle this particular section. So if council would want to amend the ordinance to strike out that whole section C, we can revisit it in a separate piece.
I would be fine with that. Are there any other? Mr.
Madam
Grissom?
I think I heard my name.
I saw Mr. Grissom-Meyer's hand, and then I will.
Oh, okay, thank you. I wasn't sure. I think I may have spoken over. I would just reiterate that currently in our current ordinance, there is no allowance to have these structures in the side yard or rear yard. The intention of this is to create a right or grant a right to have them there for our residents that does not currently exist, which has, although there may be some there which have been placed over a period of time. So it's to codify and provide to our residents a right to place them where there is nothing currently in our zoning ordinance that has that. There's nothing permitted currently of any structure in a side yard, and there's currently nothing permitted of that type of structure in a rear yard, a required rear yard. So the intention is to codify and allow those to occur at that point. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Grusmeyer. I understand that. But however, so when someone comes to the city tomorrow, let's say, or yesterday, and says, you know, I'm getting this generator, they don't need a permit, they do need a permit, what happens? Could someone tell me the process?
Certainly, I think if the question was to me, I can certainly respond.
Anybody,
Right.
Yeah.
Right, certainly, generators require a permit, correct. Currently, just the way our zoning ordinance reads is that there are no structures or items allowed in the side yard at all. So, and the rear yard, we look at required rear yard, it's not a listed permitted structure in required rear yard. So we'd be looking at something that would be out of the required rear yard. For the most part, yes, there's a permit required for it, and as it stands, they'd be required to have it outside of the required rear yard, which means, for example, the required rear yard is 50 feet. If you had 70 feet between the back of your house and the back lot line, you would have 20 feet that isn't the required rear yard in which you could place it currently. I mean, as far as installing at the location of a generator, really isn't dependent upon the location of a condenser for an air conditioning unit. They're really two separate items. Any generator that goes in will have a specific gas line run to it from the initiation of the gas service back to where the generator location is, and we'll have electrical lines run to it, you know, totally independently of any other appliance. So that it's not, the location of the generator itself isn't reliant upon the location of any other particular appliance within the house. It's just you'll run a separate individual gas line to it from the gas service entry, and it will supply then electricity back to the service entry, which is electrical depending on wherever it's at. So yes, there is a permit. Currently, we look at them. They occur as long as they occur currently in a rear yard that's not a required rear yard. And with the noise ordinance, it helps us because now we have a definite dimension we can give to an applicant, so they can kind of measure to adjacent residences to know the location where it can go. So hopefully answers your questions. I'd be happy to answer anything else you have.
Guess I should unmute myself. Ms. Heeman, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Ruschmeyer, and I understand the installation of the air conditioners and the generators, but you know, the cost of adding those gas lines and electric lines, if they're not conveniently located, if you're not putting that generator or new air conditioner, you know, in that location, could drive the cost up considerably for residents, and I don't understand why we would not want to help them. The generator itself costs a lot of money. The work to get it done costs a lot of money. You have to pour a concrete pad. There's a lot that goes into it, right? And digging gas lines all the way around your house may or may not be permitted if you live in a homeowners association, for example. So 2 or 3 of my developments are exactly that. And in most of those situations, the air conditioner is already on the side of the home, as are the gas lines. And so I just don't think that this language works for those developments. And I understand and respect that you're trying to make something conducive, but you know, we all live in North Olmsted, and you have to respect those of us that live here when you're making the rules that we will live by. Thank you.
Mr. Limpert?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the directors clearly articulated that right now we have a bunch of air conditioners out of conformance with the code, and that could be cited. We're trying to open this up to make it more permissible. So what I'm looking at is, are we asking then to add the front yard as well, or add additional distancing? I guess I'm looking for what Ms. Heeman wants to do to enable this more, because currently we're restricted and there's a lot out of compliance. So the effort of this is to actually open it up and not restrict it. So I'm interested to know, well, what's the proposal to further open it up, given that right now we have a bunch of residents out of conformance.
Ms. Heeman and then Mr. Glassburn.
Are you asking me, Mr. Limper, to tell you, or are you asking our building department experts to tell you?
Well, I'm looking for the council members that think this isn't sufficient, that right now we should strike this and leave these items out of conformance.
I don't think anything should be left out of conformance. I think that we have to consider what we already have, that the folks want it in the same place when they replace it, and that might be great if they're grandfathered. New homes obviously might not be built that way, but now you're talking about a generator that, you know, somebody now wants a generator. They shouldn't have to, they should be able to determine really where on their lot and structure and budget it best fits, rather than, you know, they're going to rip something up in their backyard to have to do this.
So Madam Chair.
I don't like some of my developments are built with sump pumps on the outside in their gutters. Nobody knows why, because it's wintertime in Ohio. So I don't know why that was then, but Mr. Limpert, that's not my expertise. I can only tell you what the objection of my residents would be.
So Madam Chair, what I'm trying to understand, so I guess maybe we need to be more clear in what piece of the code is making this out of conformance right now. If maybe the building department could answer that.
If that question is to me, I'd be happy to respond. Currently, there are existing locations where we have equipment that are not, may not be in conformance. They're existing non-conforming locations. There's no one going to walk around the community and ask anybody to move them or change anything or do anything like that. So that anything that's an existing non-conforming location. I think what the intent here is to codify it, to provide a right to the resident to place it there. It also codifies and allows those to remain. I'll kind of circle back a little bit to the concern over electricity or gas lines being underground or whatever else. The gas that's provided or comes from from a generator, for example, the gas will be taken from inside the home, not outside the home. Most likely, the electricity is also inside the home, the main service panel. So the services to that, there's no premium to be paid locating it in the backyard versus a side yard when you have a generator. The running of the service lines can also be above ground, so there's no reason both electrical and gas can be run above ground. In fact, it may be easier and safer. Can be run above ground, so there's no reason to be digging anything to install them that run around the back. And if you have a basement or crawl space, your services are probably already there. They usually run, all the ones we've seen are generally run through the basement if they have a basement, to just simply go out the back of the house above grade and serve it, and at that point. So that's fairly easily accomplished. Once again, there's no one going to go around the city doing anything about, or bringing it to their attention. It's just as when you, as building commissioner, you see the fact we have this situation. We'd like to have the ability within the ordinance or the zoning ordinance to say, let's codify it so that the citizens are safe in their assumption they can place it in the side and do what they need to do to facilitate their installation. And once again, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn, then Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The repeated belief that those that are pre-existing or supposed to be grandfathered in are somehow exempt from this is not how this plays out in reality. Over and over and over again, I have had residents for the entirety of the time I've been on council try to replace air conditioners or replace items that are non-conforming with the same items, and then they get hassled into having to make it conforming when they replace the item, whether we're talking about carports, air conditioners, etc. So why is this enabling legislation a problem? Is that, if that's the question, because we're now adding an additional requirement. So not only will they have to move, if there's something that happens to upset the inspector that day, they're now going to have to add screening to the air conditioner that's been at their home on the side for 50 years. And we can say about how the inspectors won't do that, but that is exactly what happens over and over again. And I'm not signing up for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is sort of a two-part. This C is sort of a two-part thing, one for air conditioners and one for generators, if I'm not mistaken on that. So maybe they should have been separated to a C and a D. But the air conditioning thing, that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem as far as I see it. I'd like to ask Ms. Heeman if the air conditioning part is a problem in her area, or is it just the generator part?
May I respond, Madam Chair? Thank you. Yeah, it's both actually, Mr. Kelly, because as Mr. Glassburn pointed out, so for example, if you have an air conditioning unit on the side of your home already, and in these developments, homes are 20, 18, 25 years old, and you want to replace it, well, you will not be able to replace it in that same place because now you're restricted by this. Generators are just a new and up and coming thing, really, so they've only started to appear in some of the developments. And they also have been placed on the sides of the homes very often next to the air conditioning unit. So that's just like an appliance and an appliance, right? That's kind of like, where do you put your stove and refrigerator? And unfortunately, I think that the code that we have in place is restrictive, as Mr. Glassburn has pointed out. The new one becomes even more restrictive. So I just don't know why the simple plain language doesn't work, that, the resident can kind of put this wherever they prefer it within a certain amount of parameter, that it's not necessarily an eyesore kind of thing. And I realize, Director Lieber, it can't be that simple, stated that simply, but that's pretty much what I think, is that if a resident wants their generator next to their air conditioner that's been there for 20 years, they should be able to have both of those units where they would like to have them. And I think that they're not very loud. A generator, for example, is only going to be used when there's no power. So anyway, I think that they're both an issue, as Mr. Glassburn has pointed out as well.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Guerrero, Law Director, I saw that you had your hand up. Did you have a question or comment?
I just had a comment from an operational standpoint of how this would work. Where you have homes that are in relative close proximity to one another with fairly small side yards, there is an impact of placing a generator in your side yard for convenience when you have a neighbor next door to you who perhaps uses their windows. They open their windows. And I understand it's not going to be an ongoing generator's not going to be running every day for weeks on end. But the same could be said for the air conditioning units. And you know, right now, as I'm understanding this, and my recollection is, we do not allow air conditioning units in the side yard. Correct? In the required side yard. Is that correct? If they're there now, they got a variance or they were grandfathered. This code is attempting to permit them in the side yard with some regulations. So if we take out C, you can't put them in your side yard, you can't replace them in your side yard, you can't do anything in your side yard except go get another variance. And so when I hear what's being said is it's an attempt to permit, to give relief to these residents on the air conditioning units, that's how I was hearing that. Because if we strike C and you want to put your air conditioning, you want to replace it or you want to put a new one in, go get a variance is your only remedy. You don't have any right whatsoever. So it creates a right where there currently is none. The generators, I think, as I'm hearing it, and maybe I'm not hearing it correctly, is for noise control purposes to place it around the back of the house so that it's in the rear yard, not in the required setback area. It's for purposes of noise reduction and for inconvenience it might have on the adjacent properties. That's how I understood it. I know there's some talk about taking C out. If you take C out, I don't know how taking and removing C and eliminating that would be of any assistance whatsoever to the residents in the city, because anyone that has one in the side yard is out of luck. And if you want to put one in the side yard, go get a variance. And I don't know that telling people to go get a variance, I mean, that's why we change these codes. We bring you changes because we see people that are asking for variances. And if people are asking for variances, then it's probably not a good code, and we should probably tweak it and come up with a better way of doing it, just like we did with fences, just like we did with signs. We try to adapt to what we see happening in the community, and I think that this is a reflection of what we see happening, and it's an attempt to cure it. So that was kind of my insight on it as I sit here and hear the discussion.
Thank you, Director. I don't know who had their hand up first, Mr. Glassman or Ms. Heeman. Mr. Glassburn, sorry.
Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say that, Director Groh, I'm not suggesting we move C. I don't think that works either. So I'm not in favor of that, but I think that it needs to be rewritten in a way that can accommodate placement on the side, you know, of a home. I mean, I don't have a backyard, I don't have a side yard. That's just my example. But there are a lot of homes like that, and they already have this stuff existing. So that is the natural placement of their generator, for example. So that I'm not suggesting we delete C and move on. I don't think that works. So thank you, Mr. Groh.
Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason why this supposed permissive legislation is actually more restrictive is not because there's two underlying assumptions that are different here. When these homes were built, these air conditioners and these items were put where they were put. So in effect, there was no restriction. And then we're told, oh, you're grandfathered in. So in effect, you're grandfathered with no requirement for screening. You're grandfathered in with none of these other specifications. Now, when we add these in, we are giving more checklist items for the inspectors to come and say, I'm not going to actually follow the fact that you're grandfathered in, because if you're replacing the unit, I'm just going to write you up for all these things anyway. So that's how this becomes more restrictive and not actually helping.
Thank you for that, Mr. Glassburn. I think that helped me understand it a little bit better too. So how do we rectify the situation, and how is it going to be determined who was grandfathered in and who wasn't, and which units are new and which ones are older? I mean, is there any way to tell? Anyone? Can anyone hear me? Mr. Grusenmeyer.
Certainly, thank you. Oh, absolutely, yes. I would, basically on the permit, we look at the scope of the work they're looking for. If they're replacing a unit in kind, I've been here approximately 7 years. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm not aware, and it's not our policy, that if you're replacing a unit in kind, that you are in fact permitted to replace it in kind under the conditions in which it exists. So I'm not aware of a condition or a situation where that hasn't happened. It's possible, but in general, when you apply for a permit to do the work, you'll describe that work. If it's an existing replacement, it's replaced in what I call replaced in kind. We're taking out a 2.5 ton unit and putting in a 2.5 ton unit. It's simply an electrical connection that put it back in. It's the same condition it was before. What we're looking at is a situation where someone then would come in and want to install new air conditioning, for example, and have a new condenser that goes in. It should be identified on the permit as such, and it would be then handled as such. So as far as screening, whatever else, that's up to council, certainly if they want to screen it, where they want to allow it, but those are each identified an existing non-conforming condition under the code. And I believe we also sent something in writing after our last meeting, confirming that and reaffirming certainly what the laws and what the policy is with the building department. Existing non-conforming conditions may remain and may be repaired in the condition which they're in. And if there's any other issues, I'm always happy to listen to any concerns that anybody has if there is an issue by a resident to achieving that. So yes, there is a way. They are identified when the permit is granted, so we should be aware at the time what's occurring, and each one is handled correctly. It's replaced in kind under those conditions. If it's new, then it would follow whatever conditions that are passed whenever they are enacted by council. Thank you.
So how does it work with property maintenance inspections?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely. In property maintenance, we would only inspect property maintenance would be if it's not maintained. I mean, if the condenser itself were non-functional and rusting or falling apart or something, then it would be cited to be replaced perhaps as a property maintenance item, but then it would be replaced in kind. They would simply take off the unit, put a new unit on and wire it back in place, pipe it back in place, and they'd be set and ready to go. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure. Property maintenance only would cite somebody if it's non-functional or something is broken, basically.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Grusenmeyer, in very simple, plain language, somebody has an air conditioner that's whatever size it is, 20 years old, it breaks, and they want a larger one. That's new or replacement in kind? It's the same?
My opinion is I'm sorry. My opinion would be, yes, if the demands of the house require something that's larger, there's a condenser there. If it was a 2.5 ton condenser and the replacement comes in and says it ought to be 3 ton, we're not going to object to anybody. I mean, if the condenser's in place and it's a residential type of similar nature, whatever else, we would assume, or I believe, or my opinion is, it's a replacement in kind. It's replaced in whatever condition it's in. So if it's in that position, it would go back in there. I'm just saying over a period of time, we have, when we look back, there are conditions that have been, installations that have occurred over time. We're not going to go back and re-adjudicate history or anything else. If there's a condenser there or there's a piece of equipment there and they need to replace it for whatever purposes due to maintenance requirements, it can be replaced by whatever reasonable system exists today that would replace the system that was put in 1970 or 80 or whatever it was. So, hopefully that answers, our approach to it, or whatever the question may be. If not, I'd, be happy to answer anything further.
Are there any, Ms. Heeman?
Thank you. Okay, so then let's talk about generators. If you're saying that that's a guarantee that those folks don't have to do anything else, they can just get a brand new air conditioner, larger if they would like, and that's a non-issue. I will wait to see what happens. Generators, why are generators, not permitted to be next door to your neighbor? Like what would the whole logic of that be? Because if your air conditioner is on the side of your home already, that is a resident's natural preference, it seems, for their generator to be placed there.
Oh, certainly, we have had, but well, I want to point out there's a little bit of a qualitative difference between the two, or at least in sound. So both size and sound. So a generator, let's start off with a condenser. A condenser is, in general, in size is about 30 inches by 30 inches by 30 inches, a large box. Their decibel level is somewhere in the range in probably the low 50s, which would be similar to two people speaking very softly to each other when they're running. They're really not very loud. A generator is probably about 4 times the size, and their decibel level averages 66 to 67 decibels at the normal 23 or 10 meter measuring distance, which is more equivalent to two people shouting at each other. And those are rough comparisons, but sound is a difficult thing to analyze sometimes. But so the condensers are just much louder, and I think our planning director's concern is that the current noise ordinance, which is I think it's a good ordinance because it relates back to the decibel level and a distance from the house. So the neighbors' houses are protected from that level of sound. It would be not impossible, but extremely difficult to find a lot in North Olmsted where you'd have a side yard available and yet would be have that distance from the neighbor's house. And I think there's also a concern because not only is it decibel level, but when you place if it's in the rear yard and it's open and the sound is open to escape, it's one thing. When you place it in the side, if it's in the side yard next to a house, there's an echo effect also that occurs from the generator off the house. Now, I don't know that there's I think it's just a concern on the planning director's part that if we place it there, it may lead to some other misunderstandings with residents when they look to place it. I also think just the possibility of placing something in a side yard and maintaining those distances and not having the echo off the side of the house, for example, toward the adjacent neighbors would be very difficult. So I think we're just looking to avoid some of those difficulties. We have smaller lots through most of the city, and we have had even recently when someone was installing a generator without a permit in the side, and of course the neighbor called because there's just a difference between the level of sound and the size of those units when they're placed in the side yard. So,
May I, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Grusenmeyer, I can respect that, except the fact that the generator doesn't run all the time. So I'm really not buying into that because the noise ordinance, according to the mayor, when it was presented to us, was just really great. And it just would run this self-test at, just a certain time in the morning through these daytime hours, self-test once a week, once every month, whatever it was. And that the generator noise was really not a problem at all, not for anybody, because it doesn't even run all the time. So I understand that they do make a little bit more noise. I understand that the new ones are pretty quiet. And the fact, though, that it doesn't run except for in an emergency. So I don't know why the daily objection exists on the, by the planning director. I can still only tell you that for most of my residents, that doesn't work. So, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, you're correct. Yes, they only run intermittently as opposed to a condenser. The fact is, yes, if you allow them both to be placed inside, if both condensers and generators to be placed in side yards or rear yards under the same conditions, the only thing there would be the effect that if the noise ordinance is enforced, which it should be, for distance, is that on a practical effect, most generators would still be restricted to a rear yard based upon noise and distance.
Madam Chair, if I may, Mr. Mayor, I can't get the noise ordinance enforced when there are live bands at bars. So I don't know what's going to happen with the generator. I still am very much against this, that they have to be placed only in rear yards. It just doesn't really help my residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just point out that a generator makes less noise than a lawnmower. So we don't suggest that people can't mow their side yards. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Lieber or Mr. Grusenmeyer, is there a way that we can perhaps allow generators to be placed in side yards, considering that they are in fact not used all the time? And I think it's more of an emergency basis than than a everyday summer thing. I mean, is there some kind of bend we could make here?
I'm going to let Kim address this. I believe she's looking to address it.
Yeah, Madam Chair, we can make whatever amendment the majority of council wants us to make. If you want us to, in this amendment, treat generators the same as air conditioning units, we can do that. If you want to eliminate the screening requirement, we can do that. These are our recommendations, and if council wants to make those changes, you can make that part of your motion, and we'll make those changes.
May I ask a question in regard to screening? Just from my own knowledge, I mean, it's my understanding that air conditioning units kind of bring air in. If there is a screening around them, could that screening potentially, in essence, not allow the units to get the air that it needs to flow through it? Could it hinder the airflow, is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, the condensing unit itself usually has an up discharge fan. The condensing unit itself doesn't bring air into or out of a residence or a dwelling or a building. The condensing unit itself just has an up discharge fan, which simply cools off the inner coils which are in that unit. So yes, there is a clearance around it that needs some air, but it really doesn't, and there are some clearances required for the condensing unit by the manufacturer, but it doesn't exchange air between the house and the condensing unit. It simply blows air over it to encourage cooling of the inner coils.
Right, but where is it getting the air from? It's pulling it in from the sides?
Correct,
right?
yes, and there is,
Okay.
yes,
So-
and there are.
So if I'm a resident and I don't know that, and I'm trying to screen my air conditioner, I could potentially be setting myself up for disaster if I'm not reading the manual and trying to figure this out, right?
Well, correct. If you put a fence too close around to it, you're going to limit it. So yes, certainly screening is up to council's. It's an aesthetic address. I don't know that there's any, strong and hard feeling from the building department's point. And we sometimes the fewer things you have to enforce, the easier it is. But my experience is we get the most calls based on two things, and that's light and sound. Something, they have lights on that are bothering me, or somebody's making too much noise. So it's always a concern. But screening is an aesthetic a judgment of whether you'd like to have that or not. It's certainly up to council. Where it's placed or not, where you place them is certainly, you can write anything you would like within there. The concern would be if it's in, we do receive concerns from neighbors when generators go in side yards, but that's a matter of noise, and yes, they don't run that often. It's all a judgment call. And once again, if you want to place generators on the lot under the same conditions that you're looking to place the condensing units in the more liberal area, and leave the determining factor, the noise ordinance, that can happen also. It's just that the limitations on the noise ordinance where they're placed would make a side yard somewhat difficult.
So a resident using a generator now could potentially be in violation of the noise ordinance. Is that what I'm hearing? Is that my understanding?
Well, I'm not sure. We have not, the location of them used to be approved by the services director at some point. So theoretically, generators were placed at a point where they would not be. It was very difficult to establish that. What the noise ordinance, the revision of the noise ordinance did was actually relate a decibel level to a distance that's in the manufacturer's literature for most of them. So we have a good distance. And it also, instead of measuring the new noise ordinance, instead of measuring the noise to the property line, measures it at the adjacent house. So it was a liberalization of where they could be placed. Every one of these has been a liberalization as to what a resident can do with their property. So I'm not aware of any. We haven't been getting a lot of complaints on them. I'm not aware of anybody in violation. In general, if the generator were placed in accordance with its permit where it's at, we would have to respect that currently at this point, unless some other conditions changed. So I'm not aware of anyone asking or complaining about or citing a generator currently for a noise ordinance.
Thank you. Are there any, Mr. Schuman?
12 inches for a condenser for screening. That's the recommended number. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Comments? Ms. Heeman?
Thank you, Ms. Williamson, Madam Chair. I would actually like to see Director Lieber present us with a rewrite of this whole air conditioning and generator thing. I don't think that I need to present language to her. I've expressed, my opinions, my desires. I think Mr. Glassburn has done the same. Mr. Lippert had a few comments and statements. And so I think really that would be more appropriate that it come from her department and from her. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Limpert?
Yeah. I mean, I think from the conversation, treating generators like air conditioning sounds like that meets closer to the mark of what I'm hearing to be a majority of council, although I've only heard 3 opinions so far, which isn't a majority. But I would be fine with screening or without, but I do think we should remove evergreen, as I think it's prescriptive of vegetation. It doesn't need to be. But that's my opinion, and it sounds like we've only heard 3 people. So before we ask for rewrites and things like that, I think we should truly understand if there's a majority of council that's not comfortable with this amendment, section C.
Ms. Heeman, and then Mr. Kelly.
Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair. Generators are treated exactly the same as the air conditioners because there would be no grandfather provision. So there would not be an existing generator to be replaced, right? So if they're going to be treated the same, then their placement, it should be the same, that they could be placed at the side or at the rear. And that, I believe, should be at the resident's choosing. Thank you. And that's what I would like to see.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
I'm fine with lumping the generator in with the air conditioner in that parameters for that.
Thank you. Director Lieber?
In the interest of time, I think it would be simple to amend C to read air conditioning units and generators, so adding and generators, and retain the rest of that paragraph. If council wants to continue to require screening, we can leave that sentence where such units are located within a required side yard, screening is required. And then we would strike generators are only permitted in rear yards, but we would maintain all mechanical units are subject to the requirements and restrictions contained in Chapter 555 noise control. I think this is a pretty clear direction council just provided, and I don't know that coming back with new language, that's what the language would be. So if council is comfortable with that, that is fine with the administration.
So we would be allowing then side air conditioners and side yard generators.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. And then as far as the 50-foot in A?
It's my recommendation that we keep that as is. If council wants to allow dwellings to project into the required front yard, again, that would be a policy choice that would affect, every residence in North Olmsted. So that's up to council.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn, would you like to address this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, our current code doesn't specify the 50 square feet. So we're adding a restriction where one does not currently exist. So I'm not aware of front porch bandits out there building large structures or problems. And so if somebody chooses to make a slightly larger porch or slightly larger stairs, I'm looking for less things to trip them up. So I would just remove the 50 square foot limitation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So, Director or Mr. Grusenmeyer, would either of you be able to tell us if it's ever been an issue with this, without having this 50 square foot requirement? Or is this just kind of anticipating a future issue?
My understanding, Madam Chair, that this was a housekeeping item building wanted to clarify.
But if someone had brought plans for something that would exceed this, would they be rejected? Would the plans be rejected? Or would they be permitted to proceed with building the structure? I'm just trying to understand it, that's all.
Currently, there's no limitation on the size, so it allows, I think the intent was always that you have a house or you have a porch and in front of it you have steps, and they wanted to allow the steps to project into the front yard. Currently, that since there's no limitation on size, that could be expanded to create basically a deck type structure or a concrete structure that would be as high as the first floor, that would stick out 8 feet into the front yard and be as wide as the house or wider. So it could be extremely large. We've had a couple that, I don't know if anybody who's really made it as wide as a house. We've had some that get larger and larger. My concern was that if the intention, once again, it basically is what's the intention of the ordinance. If the intention of the ordinance is to give a citizen or the ability to have steps entering their house that stick into the front yard, that's great. I don't know if the intention of the ordinance was to have something that could be that large. Once again, it's up to, I was looking to avoid what I thought may be a possible issue if someone came. We've had a couple that get larger and larger. So I was looking to avoid an issue if someone came and really wanted to build a very large structure in front of the house, stuck to complete out 8 feet out in front, was 50 feet wide. I don't know, once again, I'm looking to avoid a possible issue that if it happened, I think the neighbors may not be, necessarily enamored with it. But once again, it's a decision we're attempting to avoid, in my opinion, the possibility of something occurring which may be objectionable to the neighbors in the neighborhood, should it happen.
We currently have residents who have full-on gardens that encompass their entire front yard. And there's nothing that we can do about that. And it's a garden. We're not telling them how to keep their front yard. And while I understand the intent, I also feel that it's restrictive upon the property owner, because we don't tell them what to do with their front yards. And I don't know how we can tell them that they can't have a porch. I don't think anyone's building a porch that goes to the sidewalk or that their stairs are going to the sidewalk. I mean, if it's not been an issue, I don't see a need for this, and I would have to agree with my colleagues on this one, as well as placing the generators and the air conditioners in the side yard. So that's where I stand on that. Is there any other questions or comments from committee or council? Okay. I am going to then make a motion to recommend the passage of ordinance number 2020-145 with the following amendments. And that would be to remove the 50 square foot area. So perhaps I think maybe even would we have to eliminate just the entire A at that point? No, so we're going to remove the restriction.
Madam Chair, if I could, you would remove the words not exceeding 50 square feet in area, including steps. And so I think that red text, not the first one, I think we want to keep the code required guards and handrails Actually, we could just go back to the original version. Let's go back to the original version. So we could just eliminate the bold red, and we can bring back that struck out word building. So A would read as it presently reads in the code.
Okay. So we'll amend section A, and then we will amend section C to include generators and air conditioners in side yards, and then remove the evergreen from the vegetation, and perhaps maybe just remove the entire screening altogether. Why don't we just do that? And we'll leave it to the discretion of the homeowner, whether they want to place any kind of screening around their own units.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, and that passes with a vote of 3-0. Is there a need for us to meet again, or can we review these perhaps before our next committee or our next council meeting? Maybe around 7:30, just to make sure that everything is covered and we're good to go?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Director.
the recommendation is with the amendments, and so we'll have those amendments to you by the normal time legislation goes out for the next meeting. So
That's
I think
fine.
a couple weeks, I think it is, because we got an extra Tuesday this month.
Yes.
So we'll get those to you well in advance, that you can take a look at them and then provide input if they don't seem to meet the objective of the committee. Be happy to do that. I don't know if you have to meet, but we'll certainly, you'll get those well in advance.
I was going to say that perhaps if there's any issue, we'll just call a meeting. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that will conclude our meeting then at 8:21 p.m. Thank you, everyone.